Olá a todos, muito boa tarde. Bem-vindos a esta nossa sessão do Alumni Learning Program. Hoje com a professora Batia Wiesenfeld, que já será devidamente apresentada. Como já provavelmente terão notado, o nosso formato de videoconferência hoje é este webinar de Zoom, o que significa que a nossa interação será um pouco na base das funcionalidades que estão ativadas e, portanto, as perguntas, comentários que possam ter devem ser através da funcionalidade Q&As ou mesmo da do chat. E, portanto, animo-os a fazerem. Gostava também, aliás, como também está no ecrã, como tem sido habitual, de vos anunciar as próximas sessões do programa. No dia 15 de junho, uma sessão sobre toda a problemática da presença do cliente, enfim, não fisicamente, mas dos temas do cliente no boardroom, que será tratado pelo professor Ramiro Martins, bem conhecido de muitos colegas, e chamar-vos a atenção para a realização da Assembleia Alumni dos 40 anos, no próximo dia 25 de junho. Tem sido um tema que temos aqui recorrentemente anunciado e também pela própria comunicação da escola está confirmada. Esta Assembleia será uma Assembleia virtual, não será uma Assembleia presencial. A partir da próxima semana serão abertas as inscrições e os registros e, portanto, agradeço que estejam atentos e possam também fazer a vossa inscrição atentamente. Evidente que não é o ideal, gostaríamos muito mais de poder ter a possibilidade de fazer uma Assembleia presencial, mas dadas as circunstâncias, penso que se preparou um evento com muita qualidade e que fará jus também ao aniversário que estamos a celebrar. Dito isto, I will switch now to English. As you know, the conference today will be held in English. And I will hand over to my colleague Marta, that will introduce our keynote speaker today. Marta.
Thank you, Francisco. So I should welcome Batia and present her here. Batia Wiesenfeld is the Andrew Professor of Management at the Leonard Stern School of Business at New York University. She was the chair of the Department of Management and Organizations from 2012 to 2018. She received her PhD in Management and Organizational Behavior from the Columbia University Graduate School of Business. Her teaching and research interests focus on management and organizational change. She has examined organizations in various industries, for example, banking, technology, telecommunications, and public utilities, undergoing downsizing, restructuring, and reengineering programs, exploring how to maintain the productivity and commitment of remaining employees. So an issue that is very up to date nowadays. She also studies virtual work and telecommuting initiatives, online communities, and the careers of top executives and directors. Her work has been published in numerous academic journals, as well as manager-oriented journals such as Harvard Business Review. So now I should hand on to Batia, and thank you for having you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Marta, for such a nice introduction, and look forward to a chance to share with all of you. So the future of remote work, I think, is a revolutionary future, but it is a revolution that, as Mark Twain, a great American writer, wrote, it is a revolution that was happening gradually and then all at once, as most changes happen. So the agenda that I'm hoping to cover today is to first, I've been studying remote work for about 25 years now. So I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit of background. Remote work 1.0, what did we already know from studying remote work for 25 years? And now in the COVID era, what are we learning about remote work? And then I'll end looking to the future and trying to understand, what does all of this mean for organizations, for managers, for all of you? And I look forward to getting your questions after that and having more discussion. So first of all, what we do know is that before COVID happened, remote work was very rare and very irregular. And this is the data from the United States. You can see that the vast majority of some 85, 86% of employees never worked remotely at all. And then the next largest number were those who worked occasionally. It was very rare to work remotely. And what's interesting is that significantly lower levels of remote work were observed in Southern Europe relative to Northern Europe and Anglo-Saxon countries. And in fact, of all Western European countries, as of the last data that I was able to see, which was from 2007, Portugal in particular had the lowest adoption rates and the lowest managerial support for remote work. And it does seem like this phenomenon that is true of all of Southern Europe is probably a function of a greater likelihood of living near one's workplace in Southern Europe. There also are prevailing norms of socializing at work with one's colleagues that you would miss if you work remotely. And it does seem like there are significant differences, cultural differences in managerial style preferences that lean towards more direct monitoring of workers. And all of these factors probably contributed to not only the fact that there were low levels of remote work worldwide, but especially low levels in places like Portugal. Work from home was definitely more prevalent for certain types of workers. So teleworkers were generally selected, not everyone was allowed to work virtually. They were generally selected based on two criteria: that as workers, they were autonomous enough to use their time flexibly, but at the same time, they were generally selected because they were trustworthy enough not to take advantage of the flexibility that they were given. And the employees with greater personal bargaining power were also more likely to be given the opportunity to work remotely, because remote work was viewed as a privilege in the pre-COVID era. So you can see that more educated and more well-paid employees were more educated people with 4 years of college were much more likely to work remotely. This was even further exacerbated in the COVID. The darker is the COVID, red is for the COVID era, and you can see that at more days remotely, both before COVID, the black, and during COVID, the red. So what do we know from the past about what's the effect of remote work on outcomes that matter for organizations, on performance? So first of all, let's start with the firm level. And what we know is that there is a modest relationship between firm financial performance and employees, and having a higher proportion of employees who are remote. But we really don't know what's the direction of relationship here. It is, it's very possible that there's selection effects or reverse that are banned, more technology and it's not a function of remote work itself. It does seem like there are cost savings associated with remote work, but those cost savings are especially likely to emerge when flexible offices are introduced along with remote work. And that is actually only true in a minority of organizations. So the cost savings are not as clearly the reason for improved financial performance. There are positive associations with innovation and strategic flexibility. And I wanted to highlight that finding because it was also shown in a Spanish firm sample, so maybe kind of similar culturally to Portugal. But once again, the causal direction is not clear. It's very possible that the innovative and strategically flexible firms are the ones that are allowing remote work, and it has nothing to do. It's not that remote work is causing innovation and strategic flexibility. At the individual performance level, there the evidence is much more clear. So there it was decades of evidence that is very robust that remote work increases employee performance and productivity. And then the question is why? Many of you know from working remotely for a while, but the reasons in the past were that at home, relative to the workplace, people experienced fewer distractions. Remember, this is in the pre-COVID era, fewer distractions, but for sure, still appropriate today is that they had increased autonomy. They felt like they had more freedom and more ability to decide what to do and use their time wisely. But it also is true that when people work from home, they definitely work more hours. And that also is something that we continue to see. There are other robust work from home effects from the before COVID, the BC or before COVID era. So there does seem to be a curvilinear relationship with job satisfaction and commitment. People who work from home a moderate amount of time are more satisfied and committed, but those who work from home all the time are less, then it turns back down again, and then they are less satisfied and committed than those who work from home a moderate amount of time. It turns out that a lot of employees on average, and this is data, whether it's in Asia or in the US, there is evidence of employees being willing to take a pay cut to work from home, a pay cut of about 8%, which is quite a bit. And it also seems that that workers tolerate bad bosses, more toxic relationships at work better when they work from home. That may be because they have less contact with that bad boss, but so working from home kind of reduces the likelihood that someone will leave when their work situation is more toxic, whether it's from a bad supervisor, difficult to get along with supervisor, or difficult to get along with coworkers. Prior to COVID, there was lower work-family conflict and stress among virtual workers, remote workers, lower turnover rates, lower real estate costs, and environmental and commute savings. But there were also definitely some liabilities that we already knew about. So there were weakened work relationships and the sense of being isolated among remote workers. There was a sense that it was harder for them to get to know those that they worked with. And there is definitely evidence of career progress slowing down among remote workers. So fewer promotions and lower status for people who were remote relative to those who were working in the office. And this was especially associated with two factors: how frequently they were, how intensively they were working remotely, like how many days per week they were working remotely, And if they were women, then working remotely was especially harmful for women, reducing their career progress and setting back their promotions. There was definitely a turning point. So a lot of the benefits of remote work were counterbalanced with work intensification and exhaustion. And that largely occurred when cloud and mobile technologies came on the scene. So remember, I've been studying this for 25 years. The iPhone came out in 2007. So it's really since that 2007, 2009 period that we start to see this switch to recognizing much greater stress associated with working from home. What about innovation? Everyone asks about innovation. And in that context, the historical evidence is equivocal. It's not clear. It definitely seems like working from home is more effective for autonomous or modular innovation, where you can separate out different projects, as opposed to like the bigger kinds of innovation that require much more intensive and reciprocal interrelationships. So virtual hackathons and interorganizational teaming are the kinds of examples that had been studied in prior work. Software development teams, for example, but software development is a great example of modular innovation, where it's very innovative, but it is divisible. You can give people different tasks to do and then bring them together at the end. And the evidence is that remote work actually facilitates and speeds up software development, but that may be a function of the fact that software developers work better when they work heads down on their own. So the productivity gains from not having distractions may be what the driver there. So on the other hand, remote work seems to undermine systemic innovation that require these forms of reciprocal interdependence, where people are constantly collaborating and changing with one another and adapting to one another. So it is important to recognize that remote work 2.0, the pandemic experience, is definitely different. So before COVID, remote work was generally low intensity. People were coming in one day, working from home only 1 day a week, 2 days a week. It was considered exceptional. Only a few, as I showed you, only roughly 9% of workers were working 14% of workers were working remote at all, even occasionally, and actually 4 to 5% were working full-time remote. It was predominantly voluntary. It was disproportionately female. The alternative to working remotely was being in the office. And we had childcare and elder care systems that could provide support and make the environment less distracting. But under COVID, so the UC category is that it's high intensity. Everyone is working full-time remote in many cases. It is universal. So, more than half of our workforce is working remotely still in the United States. It is predominantly mandated. I just heard from Francisco that the Portuguese government has mandated an extension of remote work for another couple of weeks. So it is predominantly mandated all around the world. The people who are working remotely are diverse from every hierarchical level, of every gender, of every race. The alternative in many cases to working remotely is not working at all, which really changes the model quite a bit. And child or elder care systems are absent or maybe generate demands as people are trying to manage educating their children at home and still working at the same time, etc. So what's the pandemic experience? What have we learned over the last year and a half or so, year and a few months? So first of all, we see that productivity generally has not suffered. And that is a phenomenon that very much is consistent with prior work. In many cases, in fact, productivity has increased in organizations. It does seem like, once again, what's responsible for that is longer work hours. And it depends on having, so the feeling of productivity, of maintaining the productivity and doing it without feeling your meetings with your supervisor. So people who had about half an hour per week of meetings with one-on-one meetings with their supervisor were able to, it seems like, prioritize better and therefore maintain their productivity without having as much extension of their work hours. Employees adapted to remote technologies surprisingly quickly. So this pivot happened a lot faster than most organizations expected. But it does seem like their effort around communication has increased. Meeting times increased more than doubled, 148%. Emails and chats are up around 50%. Stress and burnout seems to be rising. It does seem like adaptation has been faster on established teams where you know the people that you have been working with. And socialization is still a challenge, and new employees especially are struggling to get onboarded and find their way in the organization. We definitely see a disconnect in the experiences of leaders and other employees. So you can see that the leaders are generally answering that they are thriving. 61% are saying they are thriving, and only 39% are saying that they are surviving or struggling. But in comparison, people who are single are much less likely to support that they are thriving, that they're doing well. New employees are struggling more. Frontline workers who aren't able to work remotely as much, they are really struggling. Gen Z, our youngest generation, is struggling quite a bit. And working women also are struggling much more than leaders. It's interesting because women and Gen Z job applicants are much more likely to apply for remote than on-site jobs. And yet we see that the Gen Zers are the ones, Gen Zers and women seem to, by and large, be saying that working from home under COVID is more that they are surviving than actually thriving. In fact, Gen Zers are the ones who most miss, everyone misses meeting rooms for in-person meetings, but the Gen Zers are also especially struggling because they tend to have living situations that make it hard for them to do focused work. And so they, much more than other generations, are looking forward to returning to the workplace, even just to get individual work done. Our social networks have definitely shrunk in organizations. So the green line is showing what happened to, and here's the pre-COVID period. The green line shows you what happens to your close contacts and your close-knit members of a team. It turns out that people are doing much more communication, and that has, declined a little bit, but overall they're doing much more communication with those close members of their team now than they did in the pre-COVID era. In contrast, the distant networks, the people that you see less frequently, that has dropped precipitously. So people are having much less interaction from pre-COVID to post-COVID in terms of their the number of contacts that they have. In general, people have more distant contacts than close contacts, but that has reversed in the COVID era. So in general, the remote work experiment was successful. 87% in the United States, this is data from the US. 87% of those who worked remotely due to COVID would prefer to continue doing that, at least part-time. 68%, so the majority, quite a, 2/3, more than 2/3, feel that a hybrid model where they spend 2 to 3 days per week in the office is the ideal. Quite a number of American workers intend to look for another job if they are not allowed to continue to work remotely. So they see this as something they want to continue. And 26% of people want to work remotely full time. Only 25% by comparison want to be in the office full time. The rest want some hybrid. And then the job opportunities that allow you to work entirely remotely. And so far, the security risks that everyone was anticipating with workers being remote have not yet materialized in a substantial way. However, Gen Zers are struggling. We talked about that a little bit before. They are feeling burnt out. They're struggling to be heard and to contribute in organizations, and especially when they join new organizations, to fit in. And they are less engaged and excited about their work. And the top employee concerns about remote work, as you can see here, is their relationships with coworkers, reduced productivity at home, and concerns about reduced career advancement that are probably quite real based on all the evidence. Employers are, at least in the US, starting to demand that workers return to full-time in the office. And this is especially true industry by industry, not so much in technology industries, for example, but quite a bit in banking. So what does this mean for the future of work in organizations? Just a couple more slides. Number one, there is an opportunity here. The opportunity is that when we are going back to a new form where we no longer are full-time remote by and large, that is an opportunity to reset our routines. And that reset is going to have reverberations that will be seen for decades. And those reverberations are really up to most of you. They are the reverberations that will be either for good or for bad. So what are those things? Number one, we need to acknowledge that there is no such thing as a return to normal. I think a lot of people are talking about returning to normal, but the world has changed and people have changed because of the experience that we've had over the last year and several months. And so there is no way to go back. The cat is out of the bag in American parlance. There does seem to be an emergent norm of hybrid work that would be remote 2 to 3 days per week. And that, in fact, is what seems to be optimal for job satisfaction, for commitment, and also for productivity. There is a competitive advantage for organizations that have certain styles of management. So if you know what those are, then you can identify, you can shift your organization for good instead of for ill. So number one, organizations that manage by objectives, that focus on measuring people on what they achieve as opposed to how they go about their work. That supports autonomy and makes people feel trusted. However, it requires metrics and data that many organizations have to invest in collecting, and it unlocks efficiencies. It often shifts away from layers of management, and that could mean job losses, especially in the middle management layers of organizations. And effective measurement, of course, we know is an art form. There's also a competitive advantage to organizations that rely heavily on teams, because when you use teams, then people find it easier to maintain their connection with others in the workplace. It reduces status differences. It makes people feel less isolated. It facilitates that sense of being supported and learning. And it can actually, if you use agile techniques, which many teams do, it can also reduce burnout by creating beginnings and endings of days and norms within the team that allow people to manage the burdens of remote work and not have it carry over and dictate their lives. So what does it mean for managers? Well, there are weakened linkages between employees and their organizations. This overall has been strengthening an existing trend towards boundaryless careers. It is easier to accommodate more freelance workers, contract workers, we call them gig workers. Trust is being undermined in organizations today. It's being undermined especially by an increased effort to closely monitor employees who work from home. So these methods of workplace surveillance or calling all employees back to the office, even though the productivity is good and many of them wish to stay remote at least part-time. We definitely need new approaches to career development, and it's not clear what forms those take. It turns out that workplace politics, if you're in a very political organization, then people are much more likely to return to the office, but they don't return to the office willingly. They return because they believe face time is required to manage the workplace politics. And these dynamics actually are creating conflict and polarization, where employees are much more likely to speak up and complain, and they do it publicly, often on Facebook, and take much more extreme views. People get insulted because they feel that lack of trust. They get insulted more easily, and there are misunderstandings that are much more likely to happen with greater remoteness. For leadership, it probably is going to have some very meaningful changes. I think one of the indications is that a lot of leaders got to be leaders because of personal charisma. And it seems like personal charisma is less important in a remote work environment. And when leaders are remote, they tend to be less trusted. So a host of different factors that have clearly suggest some minefields for managers to negotiate. And now I would like to stop sharing and take questions and discussion from all of you.
Thank you, Batia, for this quick view of what's going on in the world. So I would like to start with some questions that we have here. The first one, I don't know if it's a question or if it's a clue for you to interpret the results from Portugal and the Southern Europe countries, which I think is nice, from Maria Silva. And she asks if there is any data on the relationship between the pre-COVID prevalence of remote work and the quality of housing. This because Portuguese houses tend to have more regarding the rest of Southern Europe, but I would say that Italy and Spain are much better in this regard. So
yeah, that's very interesting. And there definitely is an association between broadband access and remote work. And so I think that there is our technological factors for sure, that we knew those are actually worldwide. Technological factors shaped whether people were likely to get remote. And the initial evidence within the US, I think, supports Maria's conjecture about remote work being associated with your living conditions, because it seems like the people who are in the US returning to the office, I mentioned this about Gen Zers, younger workers are especially likely to jump on and more rapidly come back to the office because they are often in situations that make it very hard, and so they are escaping to the office in order to be able to get something done. So I think that is actually good support for Maria's conjecture. And then the question, then it would be interesting. It would suggest that in Portugal there would be a more rapid return to the office. I still think that there will be, especially with certain kinds of workers, especially the kinds of workers who typically were remote, the more educated, the better paid, more knowledge workers. I suspect that they probably have somewhat different living situations, and they may be less likely to return. And that could create some challenges because of the last point that I made. If the higher level folks are remote part of the time and their lower level employees are not, then there is likely to be these forms of distrust and miscommunication that could be problematic in organizations.
Okay. Then we have some questions, which it's a cluster of questions, which I think has to do with productivity. So people are skeptical when you say, like, for example, increasing productivity based on longer hours of work. Is that a fair measure? So that's the first question. And at the same time, you also have people asking the question of, are long hours of work is that a true measure of what people are actually working? So is that full of interruptions and things that people do in the middle while they're working? So
yeah,
this is from Rita and Gisela.
So the data that the data on productivity, I think it's important to understand that it's productivity per worker.
Okay.
And so productivity per worker, it doesn't mean that the workers are more efficient. Quite the contrary. The workers are taking far longer. Their productivity has increased, so they're getting more work accomplished, but it is by working longer hours. So they are not more efficient. And of course, that can't go on forever. People are not, there is burnout that is already setting in as a function of working these longer hours. And there are questions about how well people work when they work longer hours in order to accomplish the same or higher levels of productivity. So I do think I think that's a very good point, and questionable. I should say that the data is reliable because the data that we are using, one thing that I have access to is a collaboration with Microsoft. So we have evidence of what people are, of literally their communications with their work colleagues over the course of the day and the week. And we are seeing that their work hours are longer, that they're working on evenings and weekends and holidays with their work colleagues. So it's not that they're saying that they are working longer. We can actually see it from their behaviors. And there are really significant increases on the order of 30% of additional time being worked. If you include evenings, holidays, weekends, extended hours, on the order of 30% for things like email. And especially instant messaging is increasing quite a lot. For meetings, the meetings have gone up a great deal, but they are actually shorter. So people are having more meetings, but they are shorter, I guess, because you can't fit in too many 1-hour meetings. So yeah, that is
related with the cost of calling someone for the meeting. So
yes.
That's an issue.
I think that's true, but the problem, so I think that it's very easy to kind of go into a meeting and sort of have meetings with people, sometimes meetings that are not so necessary. But it turns out that when we have Zoom meetings, so these like virtual meetings, they are much less likely, at least in the US data, they're much less likely to incorporate the kind of chatting and sort of socialization that we are accustomed to when we have a meeting in person, and they are much more likely to just get down to business. And you're only likely to call these meetings with people that you work with regularly. So what we're missing is all that serendipity of running into someone who tells you something that gives you an idea. All of that is gone, and that is one of the challenges for innovation, I think, that as you could see with the graph I showed you of those distant communications that were very common in workplaces, those have been eliminated, drastically dropped. People are having much more frequent interactions with the same set of people, but the psychological research shows us that when people are interacting in person, just watching someone else, being in the same place as a person, as another person, gives us a feeling, makes us trust when we see them, when we see how they behave, when we see, you come into a meeting and you can see who has prepared, they have all their papers in front of them, they're ready to go, you can tell by their body language. It is trust enhancing, and remote meetings are not as trust enhancing. And so we are more suspicious of one another. So we're dealing with people that we've worked with a long time, and it's not doing as much good in terms of enhancing that sense of trust like it used to.
That's also Simon Sinek is mentioning that things are working well because we stand on the trust we have built before the COVID.
Yes.
But now building trust is a lot more difficult.
Yes, we are depleting. We created a bank of social capital, and we are depleting it. And so the question is, what happens when that bank is depleted? And you can already see that for new workers, newly hired workers who don't have that bank of social capital, there is much higher rates of turnover with those new workers.
That's true. Okay, so we have questions now regarding what managers should do. That's a bit more practical thing. So, for example, here from Pedro Monteiro, we have a question which is how the managers working remotely are dealing with keeping the objectives established for their teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this is a real, the key thing is that what I was saying earlier about management by objectives. So if you can, it really requires a great deal of forethought, of identifying where what you want to accomplish by when, and then figuring out ways of measuring those things so that it's not the manager who is letting an employee know when they're making appropriate progress, but rather the employees know themselves how well they are progressing against their objectives. And no one is telling them how to do what they are doing, but rather is judging them on what they do, on what they actually accomplish. But it's very hard because many managers feel that they've lost control of their employees. And a natural reaction when you feel that your control is diminished is to seize control, to become more controlling. And some of that is taking the form of micromanagement, and that is leading to the kinds of surveillance, sort of checking in too frequently and organizations that had systems that allowed them to measure employee performance on objectives were at a real advantage going into COVID. And the managers who are not working for employees for organizations with those types of systems, they have had to work a lot harder. And there is a lack of recognition of how hard many of these managers are working in order to be able to keep up and give individual attention and help their employees prioritize and help keep them on track, because it's all falling on the manager. The employees don't have the ability to do it themselves.
Mm-hmm. And we also have a particular question from Nuno Mendes, which has to do with consulting companies. So most of the times, the consulting companies depend a lot on the contact with the client and the trust they can show and build with the client. And so here, maybe in this context, it's a lot more difficult for these firms to show how they can make a difference. Do you also agree?
Yes, I do think that we are going to see that the more client-oriented industries, and that's consulting, honestly, law. I mean, there are a lot of areas where you see where it matters, the client orientation matters a lot. I think that there will be a return among them to business travel. So I think that we're going to see more business travel, and it's going to be led by those folks, but it still will be much less than it was in the pre-COVID era, because many of the clients are working remotely. And so there's much less value to being on location for extended periods of time. But I think for exactly those dynamics that we were talking about earlier, about creating that sense of trust in the meetings, I think that we are going to see those industries being at the vanguard industries that are returning to more business travel in order to be able to create that contact with the client.
Okay, we also, so here regarding all these problems we have with remote work, like building trust with people that go into the company, learning how to manage an organization and build trust among all the employees, is there any strategy we can implement already being in a remote field? So is there any way of building trust, of building the social capacity we have been downsizing now?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and what we've observed, so organizations have been grappling with this for some time now. And initially there were these, at least in the US, we had all kinds of, Zoom social events where people would call a Zoom meeting and just to socialize. And those got old very quickly. People were were having video meetings for, we called it, sort of like cocktail hours, where you would sort of happy hours, Zoom happy hours. And these perhaps they ended up being mostly complaint sessions and weren't particularly useful. I think they may have, at least maintained a sense of connection. But I think that the key thing at this point is in having, it does seem like the manager one-on-one meetings, having a regular schedule of manager one-on-one meetings with individual contributors, very often at the beginning and end of a work week, for example, or once a week, in which the manager is using the opportunity to set goals and help the employee prioritize and how either the manager or the employee, him or herself, can obtain those resources. That kind of work is setting a great, really sets up the infrastructure that enables a transition back much more effectively. The other thing that I think we are concerned about, we're very concerned about the inequality increasing as a function of remote work, where there's going to be a set of people in the office. I mean, my research has shown this, that when there are people who are in the office more regularly, that there are a set of, they're kind of at the top of the hierarchy, they move up faster, they're in the know, they share information with one another. And then there's like a second-class citizens of the more remote employees. And that would be a terrible mistake. Organizations are attempting to, very often it's because it's the ideal to have 2 or 3 days a week working in the office. That shift, and obviously 2 or 3 at home, that shift is very often about dividing up a team into, the A team and the B team. And so the A team are all together, the B team are all together. And it seems like that doesn't work very well, because you really bifurcate the connections within the team. So it does require a little bit more of randomization, of sort of saying, okay, we're gonna, there'll be a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and a Tuesday, Thursday, and I don't know which one I'm going to be on week to week, because there is value in linking us together. So I do think that it is tricky, and there are a lot of solutions that people are developing.
Marta, we have 2 participants raising their hands.
Mm-hmm.
We have Jaime Casado and António Malheiro Reimão.
Mm-hmm.
I would ask Agostinho if he could open the microphone.
It was a very interesting speech. My congratulations. Well, there is something that I'd like to ask you concerning something that is happening now here in Portugal in some companies. That is the question of confidence and trust that workers have in the identity of the company. Do you think that if some companies will force in maintaining the hybrid work and the virtual work, we can have the problem of most of the workers not feeling in the purpose of the company? Because I think this is very, very, very interesting. For instance, I know better the public administration here in Portugal. Most of the people that work in the public administration are now working virtually. And I think that most of them feel that they are losing time by time this identity and purpose belonging to the company. How do you see this in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there actually focus. And then that means that, let's say something changes in their work group or manager, they're more likely to leave than they are to sort of stay with the organization. And it also, obviously, it's very important to feel like the work that you're doing, to understand how it fits into the larger whole, to understand how it relates to the identity of the organization as a whole. And it does seem like full-time virtual work is undermining that. However, part-time virtual work does not show that same effect. In fact, people who are working 2 to 3 days from home are more committed, have been more committed to their organization as a whole, because they feel like the organization is more concerned about them, trying to create flexibility for them. And so I think that it goes back to this very tricky curvilinear effect. Aristotle talked about the golden mean. either extreme, full-time in the office and full-time at home, are actually not optimal for creating that sense of identification with the organization. And something in the middle, but of course anything in the middle is very tight, very hard tightrope to walk, but something in the middle is optimal for creating that sense of identification.
So now, Antonio, do you want to turn on?
Marta, it looks like Antonio just gave up, so just keep on.
Okay, perfect. So we had a question on the impact of remote work in the concept of cities. So is that going to change? Do you have any clue on that?
Yes, I think this is such an interesting question. And remember, I live in New York City, New York University. We're right in downtown. We've had so much benefit. And I think that, the economists call this the agglomeration effect. And many industries have evolved through industry agglomeration, where in specific cities, there are a large number of firms in a particular industry, workers in that industry, and it does seem like that has been critical to the evolution of our economies. I do think that in many ways those will change, and the costs for cities are very high, because if people are feel like they don't need to go in every day, then they can live with a longer commute and will locate farther away. And then many of the agglomeration benefits that cities are kind of taking advantage of will be reduced. I think that these are industry-wide questions. So there are industries that benefit from their growth patterns are more fixed. Take the hotel industry. You can have individual hotels, and agglomeration effects actually benefit hotels that are built and all in one place, and efficiencies that come with that. And I think that the COVID era is we see there are these alternative for business models like an Airbnb, which are inherently networked models. And we see that that COVID and this emphasis on remoteness has sped up the benefits to the networked business models and has harmed the fixed, stable, the ones that are based on more fixed and stable resources. So I think that these are, it's a great question that I think you probably know that urbanization has been a very strong phenomenon, especially in the developing world. There's been a massive move to urbanization because they don't have broadband. Maybe COVID is not going to change it as much, but it does seem like the infection rates will stay higher, especially in the developing world. Infection rates are very high in cities because they're very densely populated. I think we are going to see a leveling off of this extreme, this rapid shift to urbanization. And I think it's going to be a worldwide phenomenon. And I'm not sure what that means for cities like New York, though I think cities are still where all the innovation happens. They still satisfy. An interesting thing is there are more remote workers in cities than there are outside of cities, historically, because people can live more, are happier to be, they don't need to be in an office interacting with people if they can walk outside of their apartment and be among people and have lots of people to interact with. So I think that I don't think it's the end of cities, but I think that there will be a leveling off in this drastic shift to urbanization that we've been seeing.
Mm-hmm. Batia, is there a clear effect on the costs of remote work? So, for example, people have been talking about the decreasing costs for companies since rents decrease because they don't have as much They don't need as much space as they needed before. And also, but here in Portugal, for example, we also have a discussion on the increase in the costs of water, electricity, and all those things in the house. So, like the net effect for both sides, can you just tell us something about this?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So it is important to remember that many of the costs that companies no longer have to bear, like real estate costs, have not changed that much are more stable, and if anything, they have increased. Whereas the cost of technology, which is what we are using to substitute for those resources, those have declined. Google Docs, they allow people to learn from and collaborate in a totally different way. They allow people to be working simultaneously on a document, let's say, and people can learn from each other just by watching the other person work, because you're working on the same document at the same time. Technologies are, we're really seeing this certain costs, like the real estate costs had been going up, technology costs are going down. But what you're raising that I think is a very good point is that even before COVID, there was a shifting of risk and cost from employers to employees. And it's not socially efficient. That shifting of risk and cost. So for example, the fact that we are, instead of employees staying with the same company for their entire career, and the company that they belong to is responsible for developing their skills, educating, training them, and helping them to move up in the same organization. Instead, now we have the expectation that an employee will acquire education, acquire training outside, go spend a lot of money on an MBA program, but pay for it themselves instead of having their employer pay for it. And so that is, in fact, a shifting of cost from employer to employee. In the United States, where we don't have a lot of worker protections, I think that COVID is only speeding up that shift of costs. So for example, if you have to, everyone has to pay for their own technology, their own broadband, their own water, their own electricity, I think that is a shift that is going to happen. And there's not going to be government intervention to interfere with it, to reduce it. I'm hoping that in other places, Portugal has a better record than the US in terms of worker protections. And so perhaps there will be less of that shift, but I still think it's the way that the world is going.
We have a very rigid labor regime, which is not very fair. It's not the ideal, since we're now competing with international firms. So you have Portuguese people working for other firms with different conditions. So this also creates a lot of different levels for people in this issue. So it's not clear. But also, how can we establish the direct link or the direct causality between remote work and freelancer economy? Because people tend to do this link between the two. So we're going in the direction of people being, so they just are firms, they are their own firms, and they offer services to companies.
So I think that I think there is a relationship there, and I think it is a causal relationship. And I think that the causal relationship is that if you are remote, if your organization is remote, then number one, your workers feel less identified with the organization as a whole, as I mentioned in response to the question that we got. And number two, it is easier for you to have some people working with you, some services provided by a freelance worker. The differences between the full-time workers and the remote workers are reduced, so it's easier for a freelance worker to become involved in organizations that are more using remote working methods. So I do actually think that there is an association between those two. And at the highest end, that can be a mechanism for reversing that shift of risk and cost to employees, because at the highest end of freelance work, we are seeing that freelancers are able to demand higher pay, and so and better working conditions. But unfortunately, it's counterbalanced by, at the lower end, really a high level of abuse. And at least here in the United States, we are seeing, jurisdictions getting rid of Uber and many of these mechanisms that employ freelance, more gig workers, because they are not given the protections that they need.
Okay, this has been a nice conversation. I only want to ask one other question, Francisco, is that possible? Because I think it's the perfect question for the end. So it's a question from André Parente. And he asks, can you identify 3 or more ideas to be aware of in the context of this new remote culture to take into account in an organization where you have a mix of both blue and white collar workers?
Well, it's a great question. And so I would come back to the things, let me mention a couple of things. So number one, measurable objectives. So managing by measurable objectives works for white collar and blue collar workers and gives them a sense of autonomy and ownership of the work that I think is really beneficial. Number 2 is the issue of trust. So, trust can be built in a variety of different ways. It takes a lot longer to build it than it takes to destroy it. And so create, and it is these one-on-one interactions and small group interactions that create that sense of trust. It is, I think, one of the things that it's so simple. One of the things that I tell managers is just explain why you are doing what you're doing. When you ask for something, or when you say, when you give a command or when you give feedback, explain why. And it's amazing how such a simple thing as just offering an explanation, how much it can create a sense of trust and create a sense of understanding what the big picture is all about, and allowing people to work more autonomously in order to achieve that. And then the last issue is that sense of inequality. And so especially if you're talking about a context in which there is white collar workers and blue collar workers, is to recognize that there are going to be, that remote work is creating more of a chasm, very different experiences with these different people. And so, and very different experiences for who has suffered more and suffered less in this context. And that is going to need repair, that we managers are going to have to figure out, how do we create ladders, mechanisms that, for the interaction, for the speaking up, for the repair of relationships, to reduce those inequalities that I think endanger organizational life.
Thank you, Batia, for these last advices and all the ones that you have gave us today. I don't know if Francisco wants to say something before we...
Well, just thank Professor Wiesenfeld for sharing the great research with us on a subject that all of a sudden was so close to everyone. I'm sure that, I mean, everyone around here and for the future as an issue on managing exactly the way we would like remote work to be in the future, and the impacts on our direct companies and P&L and talent retention and so on. So thanks very much for joining. I know that this is not enough time for you to basically cover, I mean, just a bit of your research, but very insightful thoughts and remarks. So Professor, thank you very much. And just thank everyone for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing them back in June the 15th, our next session, and then the assembly on the 25th. With so, good evening, good morning, Batia, and see you then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.